Hello, I'm Chris with IWasAtTheGame.com, and today we're going to talk about something that happened 50 years ago that still affects us today in football playoffs. We're deep in the middle of football playoffs. The 2024 playoffs are at the semifinal level right now, and we're getting ready to head to the finals. But I want to talk about something that happened back in December of 1974 that affects us today: overtime. We're going to talk about a game that literally changed the path of how we have overtime. Let's talk about the OSSA football playoffs. The OSSAA started the official playoffs back in 1944. And to handle overtimes, this is how overtime was handled back then. If you ended your playoff game in a tie, then you went on the score of penetrations. Penetrations are the number of times that your team crossed the 20-yard line. If your team had more penetrations than your opponent, you win. If that was a tie, then you would go to first downs. If that was a tie, then you would go to total yards. Right off the bat in 1944, they had a championship game that ended in a 0-0 tie between Lone Wolf and Medford in Class C. Well, it was a 1-1 tie in penetration, so they had to go to first downs, which was decided in Lone Wolf's favor on a 10-9 in first down. In 1948, Wynnewood and Crooked Oak tied 13-13 in their championship game, and for the only time in the OSSA football playoffs, they had to go to the third level of tiebreaker because the game was tied at 13-13, the penetrations were tied, and so were the first downs. So they had to go to total yards, and Wynnewood came out on top on that game. But the system wasn't necessarily perfect. In 1961, in the quarterfinals, Lawton Douglas defeated Wynnewood with a tie of 12-12. Well, it was discovered after the game that Wynnewood had actually had more penetrations than Lawton Douglas, even though Lawton Douglas was declared the winner. But Wynnewood chose not to protest, and Lawton Douglas moved on in the playoffs. In 1969, Altus and Okmulgee in Class 2A tied 7-7 in the championship, and Altus won on penetrations 4-2. After that game, the OSSAA decided to make a change, and the change was that in the championship games, they would no longer be decided by penetrations or first downs and total yards. It would be decided by giving the championship to both teams. That started in 1970. Let's move on to the 1974 playoffs. Right up until the end, we had two semifinals that season that ended in tie. In Class A, Millwood and Tuttle tied 7-7. And Millwood moved on because of their advantage in penetrations. They ended up losing to Stroud in the finals. And in Class 2A, Skytook and Spiro tied 8-8. And Skytook went on to the championship to win their only state championship in school history, downing Purcell 30-12 in Class 2A. Let's fast forward to December 6, 1974. Let's talk about Ada and OWASSO a little bit before the playoffs. Ada entered the season top ranked, number 1, but they started their season 0-2-1, and they finished their regular season with 7 wins, holding their opponents to 13 total points. OWASSO wasn't even predicted to make the playoffs. In fact, they were in the final poll of the season. They were ranked number 9, so they weren't even expected to be anywhere close to the finals. And they almost didn't make it out of the first round. OWASSO played Jinx in their first round game, and Jinx took the lead with 50 seconds left in their game against OWASSO, but OWASSO drove it down the field and scored a 29-yard touchdown pass from Stacy Lamb to Frosty Turpin for a 16-14 opening round win. Ada moved through their playoffs fairly easily, only allowing 10 total points by their opponents in their 3 games. Let's talk about the game. The game that day, I looked up the weather on that day, and it said it was 32 degrees for a high. So that Friday night was very cold, plus, according to the newspapers, it was raining that night. And the game was held in Tulsa at Skelly Stadium. The game finished the first half tied 7-7. Penetrations they were tied at 1-1. In fact, the penetrations were 1-1 going into the fourth quarter. But in the fourth quarter, Ada made 2 penetrations to take a 3-1 advantage. One of those ended when they missed a field goal with about 5 minutes left. With 30 seconds left in the game, Ada had the ball. And they knew that they were up 3-1 on penetrations, and it was 4th down. They had the ball on the 17-yard line of OWASSO. So they had a choice to make. Do we kick a field goal and attempt a field goal, or do we just choose to run out the clock? They chose to run out the clock. In fact, they ran it to the sideline and ran it out of bounds. OWASSO got the ball back with 24 seconds remaining, knowing that they were down 3-1 in penetrations. But they threw a couple passes, with the last pass being intercepted. Ada and head coach Craig McBroom celebrated. They had just won what they thought was their 11th football state title, which at the time was the most in Oklahoma high school football history. OWASSO and head coach Gary Harper went to their locker room defeated. They were runner-ups because of the penetration count of 3-1. Well, during that time, both teams were informed that it wasn't necessarily a Ada championship and an OWASSO runner-up. Both teams were informed by a sports writer who happened to know the rule, which nobody else seemed to know in the stadium, that this rule was in place and that both teams would be declared co-champions. Well, this led to a few days of neither team knowing who had won the state championship, who was going to carry the gold ball. Well, it wasn't until days later that the OSSA on a Wednesday had both representatives come to Oklahoma City. And Ada high school principal Darrell Hill was quoted to say, "We question whether that is a rule. We feel like we are the state champions. But at the end of the day and into the night, no decision was made." The next day, on Thursday, December 11th, the OSSAA declared that the rule applies, that the rule of penetrations only applies to teams that must advance in an elimination series, whereby unanimously reaffirmed its position that the use of penetrations, first downs, and net yards shall not be interpreted to determine a winner in a final championship. The 7-7 tie will declare both teams to be state champions in Class 3A in 1974. So that's where it led. Both teams have trophies, state champion trophies, and they're both declared state champions. Now, this obviously sparked a new plan to be put in place. By the next year, the 1975 football season, a new overtime plan was put in place, the 10-yard plan, which is currently in place, and they implemented that in the 1975 playoffs. And oddly enough, the first week of the 1975 playoffs had 4 overtime games that were decided by the new rule. The first state championship overtime game happened in December of 1976 in Class 2A when Bristow downed Veneta 13-10. There have been many overtime games since then, obviously, but we can attribute all those games to what happened back in December 6, 1974 between OWASSO and Ada. One odd thing about Ada that year is they finished their season 10-2-2, and I'd have to look, but that might be the least amount of wins by a state championship team. I'm going to put all this on my website. I have a link that has the chronological order of how the OSSAA put this plan in place. Initially, what happened during the game, and then what happened afterward to determine the new overtime games. Thanks for hanging out with me, and let's continue the playoffs and have a great time. See ya.